it's time to rate and review the newest Marvel Snap cards. We just got the final official reveals for the July season of cards. And with those numbers and designs locked in, I wanted to revisit those and rate them all from 1 to 4 stars, talk about how good they might be, what kind of decks they might run in, and the current context of this crazy meta we're in right now. And this month seems kind of shaky. We'll talk about it as we get into these in detail, but I'm not sure how much of an impact these are going to be in the like world of Erisham and Darkhawk. There's a lot of power going around right now. That said, we'll talk about it, kicking things off here with the Season Pass card, Gwenpool. And she is a 4/6 with on reveal, pick a random card in your hand 3 times and give it +2 power each time. So that's just going to take a look at your hand, grab 3 random things to buff. It can be the same card 3 times. So, of course, if you only have 1 card in hand, you can isolate that down and give it +6. You could just randomly hit the same card in hand 3 times. Could be 3 different cards, any mix thereof, right? So it's, you know, it's definitely random, but it has some influence to it. And I think there will be decks and scenarios where you try to isolate this down to a single card and make something really cool happen. You know, a Black Panther that scales really nicely on curve on turn 5 with all these extra stats. I want to play it with Galactus. See if we can't make like a giant big Galactus stuck in hand on the Gwenpool. More realistically, though, I think just trying to hit, you know, a handful of cards that are playable on turn 5 and 6 naturally, as you want to get those stats out, will be not only the goal, but sort of the requirement for this card being good. And that will naturally exclude it from certain decks that aren't as able or willing to empty their hand to ensure that all of these stats get played. For instance, if you have like 2 6-drops in hand, you may not be able to get the stats out because it might hit the 2 different 6-drops. You only get to play one of those. That deck may not be a right good fit for Gwenpool. Alternatively, if you have a deck that's looking to like dump on the final turn and you have some kind of like hit monkey package or a bunch of 1-drops you're trying to dump on the final turn after a Black Swan or something, in that case, you know you're far more likely to get all of the cards out, which means you're going to get all of Gwenpool's stats into play. And at the end of the day, she does have a lot of stats. Like it's 12 stats, 12 power and output at a base level here for Gwenpool, which is really efficient for a 4-cost card. And, you know, sometimes those stats being spread can be actually really useful too and unpredictable. Like you'll know where your stats are at, how stacked up they're going to be and stuff, and your opponent will not have that information. So you can make some bold calls when it comes to snapping and winning games because of that information disparity over the opponent. Now, on top of that, of course, is additional stat scaling from all of the buffs. So, you know, we mentioned Black Panther, but there's tons of cards, Sebastian Shaws and Broods and Mr. Sinisters and all these cards to give you ways to duplicate those additional stats. So finding a deck that's able to benefit from all that additional stat scaling. I actually think Silver Surfer has been a classic example of that, of course, for the Shaw and the Brood. They love those Silver Surfer buffs. Gwenpool could actually slot rather well into a Silver Surfer deck, honestly. Sometimes they have a gap on turn 4 where it's like awkward and you're just kind of playing a 3-drop anyway. Gwenpool could actually make some sense there. It's not great necessarily for Brood. Can be a little hard to weave in, although, you know, a turn 6 Brood with a Silver Surfer is still a great surprising line. They could have some crazy stats off Gwenpool. The other downside on that deck is sometimes it's hard to empty the hand because those 3s just kind of get stuck up a little bit. But with things like Makari to kind of you know, create more space and condense the hand down, basically, I think this is actually a really nice fit in some kind of Silver Surfer buff package. Beyond that, you know, there's ways to try to like force this into, like we talked about Black Panther with some on reveal stuff. You could have some Wongs. Galactus sounds silly. Deadpool is a possibility. It's another card that does like to scale its stats, but I think curve fit there is weird. Like, you know, sometimes you want to scale that Deadpool much sooner, and by the time you get to like turn 4 for that turn 5 Deadpool, hitting it once or twice, it's already gotten scaled up quite a bit off like a Hulk Buster or something that's more efficient. Might be hard to get a return on that investment, or even just weave the Gwenpool in. Sometimes destroy decks have a pretty tight curve where they need to destroy things on time. Gwenpool wouldn't necessarily fit well into that scenario. So, you know, for me, I'm thinking about Surfer decks, you know, kind of dumpy decks that are the Miracle-y style things going all at once at the end of the game where those extra stats on Gwenpool are fine. I think the stat scaling stuff is sneaky, but it might be hard to find a build where it lines up well, because as I look at all of those, like, There's like Beta Ray Bill, doesn't really curve well with Gwenpool. Deadpool doesn't really curve well with Gwenpool. Black Panther sort of does, but it's like, can you get the stats isolated? What's the deck around that look like? Maybe traditional on reveals better, just run long or whatever. So kind of clunky in a lot of those worlds, but ultimately where this might end up, surprisingly enough, is just like a good Thena tempo deck where you're like playing a couple cards every turn anyway. Your hand is staying relatively small, so you're going to have a high likelihood of getting the Gwenpool stats into play. And this is just like a good tempo 4-drop. And it's like, I got 12 power out of this. I'm happy. I'm playing things out, and that's good enough for me. So don't be shocked if she just shows up in kind of like good card decks as an option there. Which 4-drops have been a little excluded from lately, but ebbs and flows in the meta will create space for those sorts of things. So not the craziest, most pushed stats by any means, but I think a solid base with upside potential makes Gwenpool reasonably good, just nothing crazy. So moving on to our next card here, it's Hydra Bob, and this one got changed a lot since the initial data mine. He's now a 1/4 and reads, after each turn, this moves if a player snapped. Now, initially there was some debate about how this worked, whether like once a snap happened, he moved like every turn thereafter, or if he only moves immediately after a snap, and it's been confirmed that he only moves immediately after a snap. So if only one player snaps, he moves once. If both players snap, he moves twice. It's not like he's moving every single turn, which I think does really limit any upside here for him with things like Kraven, because there's just not that many moves in the can for Hydra Bob. Some games there might be 0 if nobody feels like snapping. Even if you're like forcing snaps for Hydra Bob, probably going to get one move out of him, which may not even hit a Kraven, right? It's not even guaranteed to hit your Kraven. There's also Miles is the other kind of move payoff or when things move. Move doesn't really have a lot of those like secondary payoff cards. Most of the movement payoffs are baked into the cards themselves, like Vulture or Human Torch. So it's really like trying to make Kraven and Miles worth it. Hydra Bob doesn't really seem like much of an enabler in that particular instance. So beyond that, you're kind of looking at him as like a big 1-drop. And maybe say, in that Martyr or Titania space, where you just try to make that oversized 1-drop and hope that's worth it. That's tough for normal decks. Maybe there's some room in Zoo for something like that, because Zoo is often sort of filling the board anyway, and you mitigate the risks of any movement because you're full anyway, right? So it's like he has nowhere to move anyway, so you don't have to worry about him moving into a bad location. That said, Martyr does the same thing but better. If you're reliably filling the board, you might just choose to have a Martyr instead. So he kind of falls in a gap there where I don't really think he's much of a movement enabler unless more Kraven style stuff gets printed in the future. I don't even know that he's really a standout 1-drop. He's perhaps a little less risky than Martyr for those games where you don't fill the board. He might have a little more, sticking power in those cases. He's also a little smaller, for the record. But beyond that, when it comes to the sort of manipulation of this card, you're actually handing a lot of power to your opponent, because if Hydra Bob's in an inconvenient location where they don't want him, they can choose to snap. Even like a Boomer snap on turn 6 now might get some value for your opponent, because they're going to be able to shuffle that Bob around. They could even, sort of like you got 3 cards in a spot and a Bob somewhere. They might even be able to snap and try to move the Bob into a given spot, and then you got to make decisions about like where Bob's results are going to be, whether you want to stick in a game based on that snap and stuff, because he doesn't move immediately. He moves after the turn, after the snap has already been committed in those instances. So I don't know, man. This one looks like it's just not enough like stat upside for the kind of the risks or the problems inherent to this one, because that movement makes it somewhat unreliable, gives your opponent a little bit too much power. Zoo decks can probably do better. General decks, have better 1-drop. Stuff like Nebula gets as big as this very often, but, has some real notable like game influencing impact and stuff. So I don't know where Hydra Bob lives. I just don't really see a reason to run this card right now. I will say, generally, kind of philosophically speaking, this is a new barrier that's being broken for a Marvel Snap card, that it directly references and changes its behavior based on the snapping mechanic, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I don't know that that causes any problems inherently, or certainly not with Bob. I don't really anticipate any big things there, but I do, it muddies the waters a little bit when it comes to the snap mechanic, and adding these sort of secondary incentives or like gameplay things to snaps does shift a little bit of the kind of strategy or meaning of snaps in some ways, which again isn't necessarily a bad thing. That can be designed around elegantly, but it does make you a little nervous. Does that break something? Does that change some fundamental aspect of snaps? Future designs in a same space could go wonky with that, perhaps, is what I mean to say. So I don't know, just something to think about, keep in the back of your mind. Is that a direction we want the game to go? I don't know, but it's kind of a crazy card, an interesting card, a game-changing sort of card in a way. I just don't think he's a particularly great one right now. So moving on to Copycat. I think this one has stayed exactly the same since the early data mines. It is a 3/5. When you draw this, steal the text from the bottom card of your opponent's deck. And I think this card's actually pretty cool. Number one, solid base stat line. We know 3/5s are playable. Some of the best cards in the game right now. Nocturne's a 3/5, right? So that's nice, as long as this effect is going to be worth it. And I do think this effect is actually going to be worth it, because here's the deal, right? People are running cards that are good. People tend to play good cards in their deck, right? And that means you're going to be stealing the text, generally, of good cards. Now, they won't necessarily always be particularly useful to you, or like particularly synergistic. You know, if you steal a Patriot's text or whatever, you know, you may not have a great way to use a Patriot, but on average, you're going to get some good effects, right? You're occasionally going to roll into those Dr. Dooms, and they're going to be absolutely insane that you get a 3-cost Dr. Doom. It's like, oh my God, that is nuts. And sometimes it'll be a smaller upside. You get a Forge or something, but you know what? That's fine. I got a Forge, you know, that's fine. I get a 3/5 with a okay on reveal. And that's, I think, going to weigh out in your favor a majority of the time. In a weird way, it's kind of like a morph, but where the stats are normalized. So, you know, the floor is basically always a little higher on Copycat, but it still has some pretty big upside. Might not be that direct stat upside if, you know, you don't roll into like Infinauts or whatever, but a Dr. Doom can still be a big stat upside. Now, that's just purely from a, like, the text that you're getting standpoint. I think Copycat is good. Now, the other upside of this card, of course, is that the informational advantage is huge, because you will know what card your opponent doesn't have access to. Now, I don't know right now if the opponent will also see that information. Some of these effects are like symmetrical, where you both kind of see what happened, but there are other instances where you don't necessarily see what got stolen, unless, of course, you play the Copycat. As soon as you play it, they'll know what got stolen. So it may not be visible right away, but that might give you some really good information. For instance, that Patriot example, you know the Patriot's on the bottom of their deck, they're not going to draw another Patriot in 97% of games or whatever, outside some shenanigans, basically, for that remaining percent. But most of the time, they won't get that Patriot. You know that. You can play your game plan around that, right? You could snap based on the result of your Copycat. And the cool thing is, if they don't see it, which might be the case, you can snap and they won't even know why, right? They won't know when you drew the Copycat. They won't know what you see. So a really big snap advantage potentially on the Copycat result. And then also just, you know, from executing the game plan, you can really pull them in. You know, they might be waiting for that top deck out that you know is never coming, or you might just counter with that really strong kind of Dr. Doom style line or whatever in some cases. So I think big potential on board, good solid base stat line floor for this, big informational advantage upside, especially if they don't see what's taken until the Copycat is played. All of that makes this feel like one of those really flexible cards that can go in just like a ton of different decks. Any tempo deck that's just playing stuff, surfer decks, good card decks. There's just so many homes for Copycat where that makes sense. I will say, in the context of Erisham, this is perhaps a little worse, because Erisham decks don't always have good cards in their deck. Sometimes they have garbage in their deck, you know, much less likely to be useful cards, the Uatus of the world and so on, where it's you know, there are some risks there. So you basically have kind of a 50-50 in an Erisham deck to hit one of their real cards or one of their Erisham cards. So that does challenge Copycat's power level a little bit, particularly with, you know, Erisham is everywhere right now. So does that limit this? Maybe, right? I think in the context of all the cards we've talked about so far as well, they just might have trouble competing against the, you know, crazy power levels of Airshim. So if they don't fit into an Airshim deck perfectly, then do they make the cut for like the high flying Darkhawk and Airshim meta that we're in right now? Now, speaking of the Airshim meta, this card is absolutely nuts in the context of Airshim. Cassandra Nova is a 3/1. On reveal, steal 1 power from each card in your opponent's deck. Which, you know, normally this is what, a 3/7 if played on turn 3. 4 cards of the opening hand, 1 drawn on turn 2, 1 drawn on turn 3. That means normally 6 cards left in a given deck. 3/7, honestly pretty good when played on curve. 3/7's nice. That's above rate for a 3-drop. The steal also means those cards are all debuffs, so anything they top deck in the next 3 turns, they're going to get 3 cards that have been afflicted with -1 power, which won't always matter because they won't always get played, but you might get an extra, you know, 1 to 3 in debuffs occasionally throughout a game as well, kind of putting this at like a 310 total output for a normal game if played on curve. As played later, of course, it gets worse. Now, that said, with Airshim, they have 12 extra cards in their deck thanks to Airshim. So I guess if played on turn 3, does that make this a 319 instead of a 3/7? Unless I'm forgetting something, please correct my math if I'm wrong on these. Obviously a 319 is completely absurd. It's not quite as crazy scaling as Darkhawk, but it's much cheaper and still, you know, lane winning all on its own as an Airshim counter. So much the way we see Darkhawk everywhere right now and Airshim everywhere, and those two just butting heads constantly, as Cassandra comes in, that's gonna rock things again. It's gonna shake things up because this becomes another way for Darkhawk decks to reliably punish Airshim decks, which might mean the Airshim decks fall a little bit. We might have a little self-balancing again of the meta where they try to find a level basically where things kind of shake out, where everybody's happy, because this is just such an efficient counter. And the great thing about this being an efficient counter is too, it's still pretty good against normal decks. I think you're not mad about playing a 3/7 against normal decks. So Darkhawk is also not necessarily bad against normal decks, but just a little more expensive, a little more committed with like rocks and stuff. But you could see this flexed in to a lot of different decks to give them an Airshim counter where they don't necessarily have to commit to a Darkhawk or rocks package. You don't have to run the Mystique. You don't have to commit to all the stuff, right? And you still weave in Cassandra Nova because like Surfer decks now have an answer to Airshim, and Thena Tempo decks have an answer to Airshim, right? Everybody starts to fit in to this Airshim answer. So in that case, Cassandra Nova is an absolute just monster 4-star card that becomes a really flexible tech card, flexible in the sense that tons of decks can run her. She might lose steam as Airshim loses steam because she sort of normalizes back to a regular card at that stage. But I still think she's great. Anytime you play this on curve, you're very, very happy. It does fall off. You know, this is not a card you want to be playing on turn 6. It becomes much, much weaker at that stage. But you don't always have to, right? Just like some cards you run for that early swing upside, and they're okay if they sit dead in hand. So ultimately, I think Cassandra looks really, really strong, especially in an Airshim world. So our final card today here is Ajax, and this one got, I think, nerfed since the initial data mines, which surprised me because I didn't think it looked like a crazy standout. He was a 4/4 when we first saw him, and now he's a 5/5. Ongoing, +1 power for each card in play afflicted with negative power. So this is another affliction payoff style card. So you got your hazmats of the world, you got your high evolutionary decks with Cyclops and Thing creating these negative afflictions. We saw Cassandra Nova can afflict the deck with negative power. So, you know, it's kind of something there, but they may not play that many cards after the Nova. You got Scorpion, obviously. So at the end of the day, there are, you know, a handful of different ways to afflict. Typically, we see high evo, and some of those like greedy toxic Silver Surfer decks are the two most played. I saw right now, actually, toxic Silver Surfer is probably being underplayed a little bit. It's looking pretty good on Untapped right now. So there are some homes for Ajax that fit in very nicely. There's also stuff like, you know, Typhoid Mary, where you afflict your own cards and you don't worry so much about the opponent's cards. You know, if you think that the like stacked power of a big Typhoid Mary and a big Ajax is worth the debuffs of other smaller things around them. You know, throw in a squirrel. You don't care much about the squirrel's power, but you know, those 3 afflictions from Typhoid Mary kind of pay back on Ajax, and you can shift your power in taller locations. It's possible. I don't know if it's going to be good, but it's possible. So this works on both, you know, your opponent's stuff and your stuff. Hazmat also is a symmetrical effect. So if you're hazmatting your own stuff, you could kind of shift from wide board power late. Like the opponent thinks you've gone really wide and you're spread across 3 spots. And then, you know, you dump a hazmat and you kind of siphon all of that into your Ajax, right? Instead of like having it spread. That could again be a bit of a redirect. I don't know if this wants to rely too much on the symmetrical stuff. So you're kind of relying only on your opponent's stuff. Now that said, you know, obviously if you flick 12 cards of your opponent's, Ajax becomes a 5/17, which that's big, but it's not bigger than the Devil Dinosaur, Darkhawk, Ronin stuff of the world, right? It's actually in a very similar space. I think Gilgamesh also often matches or exceeds that sort of thing. But I think all of those, in my opinion, have easier to achieve game plans. Like they're all self-directed in a way. I guess Ronin's not exactly, but Ronin I think has a higher default stat in many cases these days, although maybe not in an Airshim world. But you know, like Devil Dino you control. Darkhawk you don't exactly control, but you put in rocks and stuff to control. Gilgamesh, you know, obviously in a zoo deck really naturally fits into your game plan. So if you're trying to create a power spike 5, that's super easy to achieve. I think Ajax takes a lot more work. Like if you're doing this in high Evo, number one, it's not that easy to hit that many targets, you know, like Cyclops and thing, that's, you know, sometimes 5-6 targets, but you need more than that to make Ajax really good. And any decks in particular that aren't running, you know, a lot of bodies, if they only have a few key threats, it's just going to be hard to afflict enough things to make Ajax big, which puts us back on that side where it's like, okay, well, are we afflicting our own cards? Are we doing the Typhoid Mary thing? Are we relying on our own hazmats to debuff? And that's really just about power redirects, you know? So then I gotta like think about ways to like duplicate this effect and maybe make it more worth it. You know, there's like big Taskmasters, there's Mystique for an ongoing card. We've seen that a lot, obviously, this week with all the blobs and Darkhawks and stuff. But again, this just seems to fall short. And again, that demands more pieces, you know, more support. And you're already running all these things to get all the afflictions happening in the first place. So it just feels like there's a million moving pieces here for Ajax to become a card that's as big or as good as so many other alternatives that seem to have more self-directed game plans. And I think that's going to be really tough. All right, so now let's rate these cards from 1 to 4 stars. Gwenpool is a 3-star card. Hydra Bob is a 1-star card. Copycat is a 3-star card. Cassandra Nova is a 4-star card. Ajax is a 2-star card. So there you go. That wraps it up for this month's cards. I guess kind of a mixed bag because Cassandra has the potential to be crazy. I think Copycat and Gwen are pretty solid. Copycat better in a post-Airshim meta if that happens. And then Bob and Ajax are struggling for me, which is pretty sad with Series 5 cards. Like, it's tough when cards come out and don't look that good. But, you know, maybe we'll be pleasantly surprised. We'll try to make the most out of this month either way. That said, thank you much for watching. And until next time, game on.